is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 578. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line, all the way from Denver, Colorado, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing great.
You doing good? Things are okay?
Yeah, Cube's been out for a while. I've been happy with that. I've got another Rivals League weekend, here next weekend, so I should probably play a game of Historic.
See what that format's up to?
Yeah, that whole deal. But it's been good.
All right. Well, that's great. And good luck at the tournament next weekend. And those are very important, I know, over the course of the season for your professional play. This week on the show, Luis, we got an exciting one. We're going back in time once again with our friend, the Ben Seck. TBS, welcome back to the show. It's nice to have you on again.
How's it going?
Good, man. We love having you on. Yeah, you too. And we are going to be going back once again to kind of re-look at some of the old sets of Magic. We've had a really fun time doing this little trip down memory lane. This time we're going to be covering a couple of real heavy hitters, Fallen Empires and Homelands, and we may even talk a little bit of Chronicles as well. But the focus will be on Fallen Empires and Homelands 2. Well, we'll talk about it. Controversial, perhaps terrible, maybe underrated. We'll find out when we get into it and talk about the details of these sets. Before we do, got to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. We've got Kaldheim coming up. That's the next set for Magic, if you haven't heard. And you can get a Kaldheim crate from CFB. They're up now for pre-order, and you get a Kaldheim booster box. You get an 80 count deck box. You get an Ultra Pro playmat and 2 life counters from Ultra Pro as well. You get a foil path promo. That's Path to Exile. You get 2 non-foil path promos, 5 foil land promos, 2 non-foil lightning bolt promos, a foil mutavault promo, and a bonus foil promo Soul Ring. Those were $129.99, I believe, last time I looked. You can check it out over at channelfireball.com. So that's a cool way to kind of get a whole package of sweet Magic stuff, as well as, of course, the thing you really want, which is that booster box of the new set. You can go over and pre-order those at channelfireball.com right now. If you do, use the affiliate code LR. It helps out the show, and we appreciate it. Show is also brought to you by you via the Patreon, patreon.com/limited resources. If you'd like to sign up to support the show, there's a bunch of tiers over there. You get some cool perks as well, and we thank everybody who does that. Okay, guys, so take us back in time here. TBS, why don't you kick us off? What year are we? Are we talking? How early is this in Magic's development? I mean, Fallen Empires came out like pretty early, right?
Yeah. So Fallen Empires was released in November 1994.
So really
this is kind
early.
of like
yeah,
this is like the end of the second year of Magic in some ways. I mean, I guess like Magic was released kind of the summer-ish of 93. And so we're kind of like towards the end of 94. So like almost maybe a year and a half in. And, by this time we've had like all the base sets up to revised, and then Arabians all the way to dark. Okay. So just for those who are like checking back at home, we've had a lot of super powerful sets. This is kind of the begin. I would call all the sets prior to Fallen Empires like the first generation of Magic, like cards, and people kind of like put them into a box like of just these ones, and the things that come after the dark are kind of like Magic trying to find its way. Magic actually had a really tough time understanding like things like power level, how to design the color pie and things like that. And now Fallen Empires and Homelands are kind of like Magic is a little bit lost. The card power is very, very like erratic and probably low overall. And these sets aren't very coherent. And you'll see that as we kind of like look at these designs. There's some interesting stuff going on, but ultimately I wouldn't call these Magic's shining lights.
Yeah, Luis, when you look back at Fallen Empires and think about it as a set, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
the first thing I think about when it comes to Fallen Empires is how disappointing the set was, because this actually was my first release. In that I learned how to play Magic, got into Magic, started going to the local card store not much before Fallen Empires released. And I remember anticipating it. Everyone in the store was excited because this is a point where like a lot of cards were selling out and packs were selling out. Like I think I told the story on the show already where I was saving up to get the last pack of Legends they had, and then someone bought it. It was $10, and then they never got another pack. Mm-hmm. Right? They never got another box of Legends because how would they? So when Fallen Empires came out, I remember pre-ordering 6 packs. The store owner let us sign up how many packs we wanted. Big spender. And I remember even despite the fact that I really didn't know much about Magic and I was pretty new to it, I remember opening those packs and thinking like, wow, this is garbage.
Yeah.
Like, and actually, it's an important thing that Louis said. Basically, up to then, Magic's print runs are actually pretty short. Like they basically printed to like a certain amount of, and then if they sold it out, it was done. So Fallen Empire is basically after the initial Magic heyday, they overprinted Fallen Empires by like many multiples of what was required, and it was very, very apparent in the game stores. There was like just boxes and boxes and boxes of Fallen Empires, and especially because the power level was not so high, they just sat there on the shelf.
You think this was a learning moment for us as consumers, and of course the stores as well?
Oh yeah, because like Magic was such a big collectible prior to this point. Even with the Dark, like the print run was short enough that it felt like a collectible. Fallen Empires never felt like that it was running out. In fact, Fallen Empires packs now, I mean, are not very expensive.
They're super cheap. Yeah,
right. You can still get them, and when you consider it's 1994, I mean, you have an idea of like how many of these must have been printed. Now,
I happen to have a pack of Fallen Empires in my hand. We're going to be doing a Crack-A-Pack with it in a bit, but I'm going to read the description on the back because, I wanted to touch on what you were talking about, TBS, about how, did they hit the theme that they were going for? And furthermore, what the hell were they going for, right? Like, it was kind of hard to tell by looking at the card. So here's what it says. It says, in the southern oceans of Dominaria Prime lay a continent of great kingdoms. Far from the war between Urza and Mishra, the lands of Sarpedia prospered. But as the climate changed, resources dwindled and empires crumbled. Hideous new species arose in the forests and seas, forcing the Sarpedians to fight for their very survival. Recruit these toughened warriors and vicious predators for your duels, but beware lest you fare no better than the fallen empires. So this is kind of a story of failure, right? This is the leftovers from something that didn't do well due to, I guess, climate change. Is that where we were going here?
Yeah. Also, it's not a particularly hopeful setting, and it's also a setting where everyone already got defeated. Like, that's not that exciting. It's not.
Here's the scraps of a fallen civilization. Have fun.
Yeah, it's not like, will it be, Mirrored and Pure or New Phyrexia? See the forces of good and evil battle. It's like, no, evil already won. These kingdoms all suck now.
Yeah.
Enjoy.
Here's a lobster.
I mean, I don't even know like what that kind of explanation really makes me want to be excited about. I mean, there's no dragons. There's no kind of like really resonant stuff that like makes me say, oh wow, I definitely need to play cards from this scenario. So
yeah,
it's very, very, I mean, and the cards really show it for sure.
Right. Also interesting, there's not that many cards in the set. According to Scryfall, there's 187 cards, but it may be counting the multi-art variants in that count. I'm not sure if it does, but there's some cards that have, I think, at least 3 up to 4 maybe. Yeah, different artworks, which is kind of interesting. And then also of note, and this might have been disappointing to young Luis when he was getting his 6 boosters, they actually only come with 8 cards in them.
Yeah, the booster thing was weird. It made the boosters not feel like super real boosters.
They're really thin. I have one in my hand right now, and it just feels like something that you would get handed as a promotional item or something rather than something that you bought.
Yeah, and that's whatever. Like that, obviously, I think didn't help, but I don't think that really contributed too much to its downfall. I do think that the fact that the cards weren't exciting is ultimately the biggest sin that Fallen Empires committed. And yeah, there were there's alternate arts. So like cards like Hymn to Turok or Goblin Grenade or what have you all had 4 different arts. And that was cool, but I think it also may have in some way contributed to the whole thing feeling like fluff, like feeling like there isn't enough substance here.
Right. Where you're like, ooh, what's this other new card? And you're like, oh, that's the one I already have. Oh, okay.
So I think part of that was to slow down the release of cards to Magic. I think there was a concern that they were going to like one, they needed to release a set really, really quick after all these other sets. So, I mean, if you count how many sets, I think it's like almost like 10 sets that were released in the first year and a half. So when you think about that, it's a lot of sets. So they said, okay, how can we slow it down? So we'll have smaller sets. But they still wanted to have the collectability of big sets. So they basically said, okay, we'll develop for small sets, but we'll have the art size for bigger sets. And so it kind of like, but it had all the negative effects that Luis just said.
Right. Now, what are some of the bigger themes that do end up popping out from the dried up seas and forests of Sarpedia?
So white really doesn't have a great theme.
They just have nothing. Yeah.
White is just a kind of a collection of cards. There's multiple, there's a bunch of creatures that can gain first strike or give something else first strike. Yeah, it's weird for such a small set. They have Acacian Scout. It's white for a 1/1. You can pay 1 and tap and give a creature first strike. And you also have Acacian Skirmishers, which is 3 and a white for a 1/1 banding first strike, and all creatures that band with it gain first strike.
Very similar.
And Order of Leetbird, the Pump Knights. These were big time. This is white for a 2/1 protection from black. You can pay white to give it +1/+0. That's the pump part of the Pump Knight, and you can pay a white to give it first strike. And if you made a list of like the top 5 or 10 cards on Fallen Empires, the Pump Knights definitely be on it. They were like one of the more format defining cards when Fallen Empires was out, but still not much of a huge theme besides white has a bunch of creatures.
Right.
Like, yeah. I guess I'll try to push it like white weenie-ish. I mean, there are actually some reasonable white weenie ones, like at least at the time. I mean, you have obviously the orders, as Luis said. Acacian Javelineers is not the worst, like, 1 drop for a white weenie deck at the time. I mean, contextually, it's been really like, it's not very good anymore, but you could play it.
It's also a really cool flavor when Acacian Javelineers is white for a 1/1. And when it enters the battlefield, you put a javelin counter on it, and you can tap and remove a javelin counter on it to do 1 damage to any target. I mean, that's cool, right? Like I can, especially somehow the act of turning a card sideways makes me think of throwing, an object like that. That's a really nice little design and a decent card too. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, white actually had the most expensive card in the set.
Oh yeah.
Hand of Justice. This is it's actually kind of hard to figure out why it was. I mean, I guess, I don't know. So it's 1 white and 5, summon Avatar. It's tap it and 3 other white creatures you control to destroy a target creature. So it's kind of like a Royal Assassin, except you don't have to wait for them to be tapped, and you have to tap a few more white creatures. I mean, I guess it's kind of splashy, but it ended up not being very good at all.
Combos perfectly with Acacian Town. Which is
it does. Also, it's a 2/6, so it's pretty large.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I remember being excited about Hand of Justice. Like, I remember thinking, like, "Ooh, this card is cool. I want this card."
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this was the most expensive card. So for blue actually had a theme that was kind of distinct, which was Homarids and the Tide. So Homarids are, well, they're Homarids. They're just that crab lobster people. I guess lobsters is more accurate.
Yeah.
And they have this tidal theme where. So it's the Homarid itself. There's actually a card called Homarid. It's 2 and a blue for a 2/2, and you put a tide counter on it when it enters the battlefield and during your upkeep. As if there's 1 tide counter on it, it has -1/-1. It has 3 tide counters on it. It has +1/+1, and then when it gets the 4th counter, you remove them all and start over. So at low tide, it's a 1/1, and at high tide, it's a 3/3. And then you have other cards that kind of go up, like Tidal Influence, pretty on the nose there. You know, it's tied. It's an enchantment. The tide goes up. Your blue creatures get stronger. The tide goes down. They get weaker. And that was kind of the big thing going on in blue. Though they have some classics. They have the first vehicle. Did you know that? The first vehicle was in Fallen Empires.
Really?
Ahead of its time. Bodalian War Machine. So it's a 1 blue for a 0/4 wall. It's even like a vehicle. There's like wheels on it and stuff. And it says 0, tap target merfolk you control to allow Vodalian War Machine to attack this turn or to give it +2/+1 this turn. And then if it goes to the graveyard this turn, all merfolk tapped in this manner this turn are destroyed.
Oh, so they actually figured out how to make the creatures in the vehicle go down with the ship. I love it.
Yeah, so the War Machine, you kind of crew it with your merfolk and then it gets rolling. Not a very good rate, but, you know, the Fallen Empires is really not about that. So I think that blue at least has claim to having some kind of resonant cards, but again, still like extremely weak. And power level does matter. Like you can see what goes wrong if power level is too high, right? We've talked about sets like in cards that are too good, but it's probably a bigger sin to have the power level be this low, because if there's nothing to get excited about, then that's just not interesting. If there's things that are too good, you can deal with that in a variety of ways, but not having anything interesting or strong is rough.
Yeah, no dragons to speak of, as you mentioned earlier. There's just no big exciting thing.
Oh, wait. Blue has a very big exciting thing, or at least I thought so when I was playing.
Oh, that's true. Deep Spawn. Deep Spawn is definitely a card. It's a 5 blue for a 6/6 Homarid with trample. During your upkeep, you mill yourself for 2 or you bury Deep Spawn. And you can pay a blue to make it not be the target of spells or effects until end of turn, but then it doesn't untap for a turn.
Look at that.
I actually was quite excited by this card too back in the day. Yeah. I mean, the funny part is that like the abilities didn't excite me, but the mana cost did. I just thought, well, if this thing's 8, like that's worth it, right? Like, I don't know what it does, but
well, I mean, this was like an earlier version of using the uncommon test where this thing costs 8 mana. Cards that cost 8 mana have to be awesome.
Yes.
Like that's just like, of course they're awesome. How could it not work?
How could it not be? Yeah.
Yeah. Also, there hadn't been a lot of merfolk since the base set. Fallen Empires was actually the first time that they really added a reasonable amount of merfolk. And you know, while a lot of them aren't great, some of them did get some play in early merfolk decks. I mean, River Merfolk's blue for a 2/1 merfolk that you can play blue to give Mountain Walk to it. Not great, but at the time there was actually good stats, and Lord of Atlantis was one of the better lords available. And so, I mean, there were some things to build around. Again, not great in power level, as Louis said, but you could see them trying a little bit harder with blue.
Yeah, and it really was the vibe that you got was really this Homarid thing. Like that's what really stood out. And then, like just to back up your point, Luis, and you too, Ben, about the power level stuff, you just see cards that they really do. And at this point, I think that Magic players had started to become sophisticated enough to recognize that they feel like filler, right? Like Vidalian Soldiers is 1 and a blue for a merfolk. It's a 1/2. That's it, right? It doesn't have anything going. There's no other, relevant text on it. And, these type of cards already started to stand out, I think, to consumers as just being like, whatever, that's just the only relevant thing about it is that it says the word merfolk on it. So if you were trying to do some merfolk theme, then that might be the one that filled it out. But, just as an average kid opening up a pack or whatever, like that isn't the type of thing that excites you. We were all Timmies, right? We all wanted to make big things happen. What about for black? It looks like there's a lot of thralls here.
Yeah, so thralls were, it's kind of a play on the word thrall, I believe, and thralls were basically these like kind of weird creatures that you would sacrifice to get a benefit. So not very good for the thrall, but I guess pretty good for you. You have like armor thralls, 2 and a black for a 1/3. You tap and sack it to put a +1/+2 counter on a creature. Basil thralls, black for a 1/2. You tap and sack it to add 2 black. And then there's like Breeding Pit, which is 3 and a black it's an enchantment, and during your upkeep, you have to pay two black or bury it, but it makes a thrall at the end of your turn, every turn. So you make an 0/1 every turn.
Right. And I remember, like, this is where I was at. I always was trying to combo Breeding Pit with Lord of the Pit.
Oh, yeah.
Because they had the same word in it, but they're a horrible combo because Lord of the Pit costs 7 mana, and you tie up 2 basically permanently to keep your Breeding Pit on the battlefield. So it's going to slow you down a little on that march up to 7, no doubt about it.
Yeah, and the again, the black theme does kind of come through. There's a couple of cards like Saboteur type cards. Actually, white has one of these too, where if it attacks and isn't blocked, you can have it do a specific effect. In this particular case, you had a Mind Stab Thrall, which is 1 black for a 2/2 Thrall, and if it attacks and isn't blocked, you can sack it to make your opponent discard 3 cards, or Neckrite, which is 1 black for a 2/2 Thrall, and if it's attacks and isn't blocked, you can sack it to kill one of their creatures. So you have these thralls that kind of get in there, but there's some cool cards tying them together. The Breeding Pit's already cool, like you said, for Lord of the Pit. There's a Thrall Champion, is 4 and a black for a 2/2 that has all thralls get +1/+1, and you can tap it to steal thralls. You can tap it to gain control of target thrall. It's mirror tech. And then Thrall Retainer is an enchantment for 1 black that you put on a creature. It gets +1/+1, and you can sack Thrall Retainer to regenerate the creature. So again, you do have some cool stuff. And then Ebon Praetor is kind of like the big finish. This is 4 black for a 5/5 trample first strike. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a -2/-2 counter on Ebon Praetor. You may sacrifice a creature during your upkeep to remove a -2/-2 counter from Ebon Praetor. And if the creature was sacrificed was a thrall, you put a +1/+0 counter on Ebon Praetor. So it's pretty nice design where you have -2/-2 counters and +1/+0 counters. So really elegant there. But this was your creature that ate the thralls every turn, and black comes out of it feeling pretty cohesive. And also, I didn't even mention the 2 best black cards. Hymn to Turok, which is black sorcery. Target player discards 2 cards at random. However, if target player does not have enough cards in their hand, his or her entire hand is discarded, which is a lot of ways to say if you have 1 card, you still have to discard it, which it really says something that they thought that was in question. That they thought that, you know what, if we don't tell them that this discard 2, if it hits someone with 1 card, if we don't tell them what happens, the game would break.
That's where we're at. Yeah.
You got to tell them.
You'd have a fight. Yeah. What's the other card that's the big one?
Order of the Ebon Hand, the Black Pump Knight. This is the black 2/1. He has pro white. You can give it a +1/+0 for black or first strike for 1 black. And the one by Ron Spencer is pretty badass, I gotta say. That's the one with like the cleaver and the giant like serrated like shield/saw sort of thing with like all the armor.
And it's that was obviously through flames, yeah.
Obviously the coolest of them.
Yeah. Speaking of art, like you glossed over the art to Ebon Praetor. This is the most ridiculous. Like it's definitely one of the most ridiculous pieces of art in Magic. Not maybe the most, but very close. Because it's got a big bunny. I'm not even. It kind of reminds me of like a scene from Donnie Darko or something like that.
Yeah, it does.
I don't actually know what's going on.
Well, okay, so the Ebon Praetor is this guy behind this lectern, right? Who's just like who's got a big list, and it looks like he's standing in hell. So presumably he's got a list of like the people who belong there or something. And in front is a bunny, a merfolk, and a goblin. And honestly, if it was just the merfolk and like the goblin or imp or whatever that thing is, plus like a human, that'd be one thing. I don't know where the giant bunny comes from. This is part of the charm of early Magic sets. The randomest stuff just is in there, and pretty hard to really get that sort of feeling these days in Magic. Not that it would make necessarily Magic all that much better to have that, but wow, yeah, it was some wild stuff.
Before we move to red, we have to decide what the best artwork is on the Hymn to Turox.
So there's the 3 Wolf Moon artwork. There's like there's like the wolf in the background with the dude. There's the 4 like cultists chanting in a circle. I like the Quentin Hoover one, which is like the mages with like the red purple energy kind of swirling around. That's the one I always use. And there's like 2 people at a table in like a tavern, looking like they're, I don't know, negotiating or something. Who knows?
Yeah. So what's the best one, TBS?
Quentin Hoover. I'm with Luis. It just has like kind of the most. it's the closest to what I think happens when you get hymned. Like, like there's energy coming out and it just looks like what it is. Some of the art doesn't look like hymns at all. I guess the 3 wolf moon would be second for me, but
I like the wolf one. Yeah, even though there's no moon and there's only one wolf, it still just reminds me of that T-shirt that everybody had back then.
Oh yeah,
so I'm in for the wolf. Should we move on to red?
Yeah, so red's got dwarves and orcs, so it kind of expanding like the tribe aspect of Magic with things like brass claw orcs, and the theme of orcs is that they're cowards. And this is actually a throwback to Iron Claw orcs, right? Which was an alpha of it's 2 and a red for a 3/2, and it can't block any creature with power greater than 1. So that the deal is they won't block anyone that'll kill them. Mm-hmm. And then you have like dwarf and soldier, which is 1 and a red for a 2/1 dwarf, and if it blocks or is blocked by an orc, it gets +0/+2 until end of turn. So you end up in this spot where the dwarves hate the orcs and the orcs hate the dwarves, though. The thing that's kind of nonsensical is there's also goblins. And look, I got to tell you, yes, there's technically a difference between goblins and orcs. If you're looking at Dungeons and Dragons or any other fantasy property or world, but I don't think you really need to go deep on both. Mm-hmm. It's just really tough to do both. TBS, what do you think about that divide there?
No, I mean, it like, especially in such a small set, like it's really, really hard to kind of like get your themes out there and kind of like have 3 different tribes and 2 of them hate each other in the same color. Like it's just a like really, really discordant kind of like choices when it comes to like the creatures here. And also there's I mean, Fallen Empires tries to be a tribal set. There's a lot of tribal interactions, a lot of tribes they could refer to, but funnily enough, none of them actually kind of are very cohesive. And so I think this is part of the problem. It's like they try to do too much with not a lot of like good cards, and also with just kind of wasting a lot of slots that could be like dedicated to better cards. I mean, the best card in red, I think, is Goblin Grenade.
For sure.
Like it's still good now. Like I think there are definitely some formats where Goblin Grenade is still playable.
What does it do? Can you read it?
Sorry, yeah, it's 1 red for sorcery, and you sacrifice a goblin also when you play it, and it does 5 damage to any target. Mm-hmm. So obviously super efficient burn spell. For the longest time it was like kind of the backbone of a lot of the mono red decks that were played at the time. And certainly good enough to play in some goblin decks for a long time as well. It's funny. There's actually not that many goblins in the set. There's actually 1 creature goblin. That's not true. There's 2. Goblin Chirurgeon, which is just like a 1 red 0/2 that you can sacrifice a goblin to regenerate a creature. So it's kind of like a Mog Fanatic that's much, much worse. Mm-hmm. And Goblin Flotilla. Anyway, it's not really important what Goblin Flotilla does. It's like having Goblin Grenade in a set that only has 2 other goblins in it is pretty weird and not great design from our perspective.
I mean, if you look at the set, there's 4 red cards that aren't a goblin, orc, or dwarf, or refer to goblin, orcs, and dwarves. And of those 4 cards, 1 is called Dwarven Catapult, 1 is called Goblin Kites, and 1 is called Goblin Wardrums.
Wow. Really?
The only card that's not tribal in form, fashion, or at least, kind of like by implication, is Org, which is 3 red. And this is one of the best red cards, actually.
It is.
3 red for a 6/6 trample. It can't attack if an opponent controls an untapped creature of power greater than 2, and it can't block creatures with power greater than 2. So it's kind of the big coward. But it used to be that you accelerate out an org and kill their creatures. It is a 5-mana 6/6 trample, which is pretty good for red.
Also, it has really good flavor text because it explains what they were going for. It says it's bigger than it thinks, right? Which is like, oh, I get it now. Like it doesn't know that it's big and scary, and it's scared of everything, and that's funny. Also, I have to note here, just looking. Orcish Captain. Look at the artwork on Orcish Captain by Mark Tadine. way back in 1994, that resembles the orcish captain from Lord of the Rings a lot, right? The one that says, looks like meat's back on the menu, boys, right? Like that thing looks like that. Like, I'm like, wow. I wonder if that was maybe an influence or something, because he really looks like him, like the big scary one.
I mean, honestly, just speaking to the art in Fallen Empires is pretty awesome. Like, I actually like a lot of pieces out of Fallen Empires. I mean, we just talked about Org. I think Org is a fantastic piece of art.
It's
like,
hilarious.
It's funny. It's a little bit cute. It's also like just super memorable. Fallen Empires, while the art is kind of dark, does actually have some really interesting things going on with the art, and has a lot of different styles. And I really kind of like, if the cards aren't that resonant, or at least that that nostalgic, the art is definitely nostalgic for me.
For green, I'm seeing a lot of the word elf or elvish.
Yeah, elves are definitely a big part of it, though definitely not in a tribal sense, which again is kind of the weird part. Oh, one last thing about orcs and goblins, by the way. Orcs and goblins really stretch people's ability to tell the difference between the two. If you wanted to have dwarves and goblins, that I still think you don't really want to do two tribes in the same color in such a small set. But orcs and goblins, like, there's the art style is so wildly disparate just from card to card. If you look at like the three different versions of Goblin Churgeon, all three look completely different. And how can you tell me that one of those isn't an orc? When there's some goblins that look like orcs and some orcs that look like goblins. Yeah. There's no way to actually tell the difference. And that's the sort of thing that you really don't want to end up. You don't want to end up making it so it's impossible to tell what the card is by looking at it, because that's how you get to someone going like, all right, I'll block your dwarven soldier with my goblin. It's like, oh no, it's an orc actually, so my guy gets bigger.
Yeah, but, I wanted to. This brings up a point I wanted to bring up anyway, which is, so they don't have that many cards to work with. If you guys as game industry professionals would reverse engineer the thought process and try to figure out what you think they were thinking, there seems to be this conflict, right? Where the game designers that made this set either were trying to make it inclusive within itself, meaning that like the Thrall Champion, for example, right, goes with the other Thralls, so that if you only have a bunch of these packs, you can kind of make a Thrall deck out of it, and it's sort of a package deal. But then, when you look at some of the merfolk or some of the other stuff, it kind of feels like, and some of these orcs and goblins reminded me of that too, it feels like they were trying to add to the overall number of these creatures in the Magic sphere at that time. And that feels like it's a little bit at odds, like if you just want to throw in a random, say a merfolk or whatever, because there's not that many in Magic at the moment, and we could use another, for example, versus if you wanted to try to make it work within the context of this one set. Those are two goals that don't really work very well together.
Yeah, I don't think they really intended for this to be self-contained. So, like, yes, you can obviously play some of these cards together, and some of them are designed clearly to be played together. But, like, Magic really didn't have a concept of, like, blocks or playing only one set. Like, nearly every kind of set was intended to be added to the rest of the sets. And so I think that's kind of the context you need to be thinking about the designs of this. How does this add to the rest of the cards existing? And that's the weird thing about some of the choices, like, with orcs, with dwarves, with like Homarids, there's not a lot of like in some cases there are none. There are no existing cards of these card types. So why did you happen to go back to those ones? I don't know. I mean, overall, I think this set design is kind of all over the place, and it's really showing when we're going after these card by card. But I don't think you should be looking at, like, what if I made a Fallen Empires constructed deck? What does that look like? Sets are not, they weren't designed that way. Okay.
Also, this set's just not big enough, right, for that. So let's move on to green then. I mentioned elves. What were you saying, Luis? What else do we see here?
Well, so you see a lot of elves, but there's no tribal elf theme. Mm-hmm. There's just a bunch of elves, like Elven Fortress, Elvish Scout, Elvish Hunter, Elvish Farmer. And to Ben's point, that isn't necessarily bad, because the Merfolk that were printed in this set were pretty exciting for Merfolk decks. Like Lord of Atlantis worked really well with River Merfolk. The fact that there was no Merfolk tribal in Fallen Empires isn't necessarily too bad. But elves weren't really a tribe at this point. Like elves existed, but at this point, I don't think there was a single incentive to put. What's that?
There were no lords.
Yeah, the elves weren't one of the original tribes that got lords. You had like Zombie Master, Goblin King, Lord of Atlantis were the original lords, and elves just wasn't on that list. So it was cool to put elves in because again, elves are intrinsically a cool property, and this was probably the most Tolkien-esque of the original sets, right? With a lot of like what looks like either throwbacks or things that were inspired by. But the big thing for green was Thalids, and I actually think Thalids were cool. I think Thalids were an actual win for Fallen Empires. It combined a lot of cool things. So the base Thalid, it's funny because all the themes have a base card, which is just named that. Homarids had Homarid, Thalids had Thalid. It's green for a 1/1. It's a fungus. And during your upkeep, you put a spore counter on it, and you remove 3 spore counters to put a 1/1 Saproling into play. And we actually saw this kind of come back during Time Spiral block. Right, we saw various like Sporloth Ancient and Sprout Swarm and various other Thalids, and so there's Thalid, there's Thorn Thalid, which is a 2/2, but you instead of making a 1/1 when you remove 3 counters, it deals 1 damage to any target. There's Feral Thalid, which is a 6/3, and you remove 3 counters to regenerate it. And then there's some actual good build arounds, like Fungal Bloom is green for an enchantment, where you pay green to put a spore counter on target fungus. So it's not a high powerful card by today's standards, but it wasn't unreasonable back then to start going, all right, I'm going to go ahead and, spend 4 mana a turn on my Fungal Bloom, and my Thalid pops off every single turn. And you also have a Night Soil, lovely, which is green for an enchantment, and you pay a colorless and remove 2 creatures in a graveyard from the game to put a 1/1 Saproling into play. That's just not that weak of a card.
I used to love that card. Funny that when somebody says Fallen Empires to me, the thing that pops into my head are Thalids. That's the most resonant thing for me. Yeah.
And it's the thing that they've kept. I mean, as Louis said, they re-released them in Time Spiral. I think there's a Thalid card from time to time in some of the other sets. I actually think it's a cool idea. It's very resonant. I mean, I definitely built Thalid decks back in the day. I mean, it was one of the ones that was actually had enough cards that you could probably build around the whole thing. That being said, it wasn't very good.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Luis.
I was just going to say, it wasn't that. The thing is, it doesn't actually have to be good if you're enjoying it and you think it's good. And Thalids, I felt like kind of got there. Whereas like Homarids, no one even thought they were good.
No.
Like it was really, really hard to convince yourself, yeah, this is going to be a playable strategy. This strategy makes sense. I should do this strategy. And Thalids at least were cool, and in some low-powered games could actually do something reasonable. Homarids didn't even let you pretend you were doing something good.
Mm-hmm. For the artifacts and lands, for me, the artifacts were mostly forgettable. The lands, there were some interesting ones. They had the first attempt at like a storage land with bottomless vault.
The lands weren't weak. So the storage lands, there's 1 for each color. Enters the battlefield tapped. And instead of untapping it, you could put a storage counter in it, and then you could tap and remove the number of storage counters to add that much mana. So it was pretty slow, but if you do nothing for 5 turns, your land then taps for 5 mana is not particularly weak. And then even better were the strongholds. So, or like our Ebon Stronghold, Dwarven Ruins, that sort of thing, where it's a land that enters the battlefield tapped, and you can sack it. You can tap it for 1 black or sack it for 2 black. That's right. That's an actual strong card.
Right.
Yeah, no, it was definitely played a lot. I know that some of the Necro decks back in the day actually played Ebon Strongholds, so they could kind of power out Necro faster or do big drain lives a bit earlier. I know I played a lot of Bottomless Vault because I really, really wanted to make a big drain life. So I'd get the storage land and go 1, 2, 3.
Tick-tock. Yeah, for sure.
Eventually I'm going to get you. I actually thought the land designs were pretty good back in the day because they felt like they could be powerful. And even though they ended up probably not being that powerful, like the potential is there, and I think that's actually just as important as actually something being actually powerful.
Okay, let's do a crack a pack real quick here, and then we'll recap. I just want to do this because it's fun. By the way, this pack came to us from Robbie and Lindsay from a GP Vegas probably a while back. All right, first card, Eben Prater. We did it.
I think I'm slamming that one.
We got the one with the bunny rabbit on it. Title Influence. This, by the way, I love the artwork. It's got a jellyfish. You can see the actual moon. There's some tide things happening. It reminds me actually of the artwork for Manowar. We opened a Homarid, a Goblin War Drums, a Homarid Warrior. Wow, we got an Order of Leetbur, which is the white Pump Knight. Armor Thrall, which we talked about, and then an Ication Scout. So do we just windmill slam Eben Prater and move on?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking basically some undetermined old draft format that involved these cards,
yes,
a 7-mana 5/5 would be great, and a 7-mana 5/5 first strike trample that each one of your creatures every turn is still pretty good, especially since you can pick up a bunch of chumps to sack to it.
How about a 6-mana?
Oh, 6 mana. Sorry.
Yeah, I can do you one better. Okay, so before we move on to Homelands, I want you guys just to give us the what worked and what didn't. What were the successes from this set, and what were the things that missed? I think we could start with the misses if you want.
The biggest miss is just the power level was too low.
Okay.
You have to miss really hard for people in 1994 to think your set sucks.
Yes.
And everyone did.
Yes.
So it's just way too bad. And that's combined with, I think, a not very resonant theme and the fact that they repeated art, or not repeated art. Each card had all these different versions. It made you feel like there was all this crap. And it was really weird, especially since not all the cards that had alternate art were particularly good ones.
Right.
In addition to those, just one other thing that I think the overprinting. The overprinting was really, really bad for it made Full Empires feel cheap. I remember being able to buy packs at $1.50 at some point, and it's like, okay, well, Magic as a collectible, it felt like it was dead because you had a pack that you could buy for so cheap, and the cards were so bad.
Okay. Yeah, that's a combination of mistakes for sure. What was the good stuff about it? This is considered one of Magic's first big failures, right? Like this set really flopped pretty hard. Was there any takeaways?
It actually almost tanked Magic completely. It's very possible that Magic could have, the stores actually had such a bad taste after Fallen Empires because they had just boxes and boxes sitting on the shelf that Magic really had to do a turnaround to get back from the brink. Because
is this the worst Magic set ever?
I think we might be talking about the next one.
Okay. So let's move on then.
I mean, depending on what you mean by worst, of course, but yeah, I think that this was probably one of the sets that most closely came to that most closely had Magic dying. It came closest to that. But
that's a fine definition. Yeah. So if that one didn't kill it, surely Homelands would. That's our next set to talk about.
Well, we didn't talk about the good part about Fallen Empires.
Oh, I asked that. Yeah, I was wondering if there was any good stuff.
Him to Turak.
I think that more tribal stuff is good. It did bolster some of the tribes that people wanted. People just wanted more goblins and merfolk to put in their goblins and merfolk decks. And it delivered on that. That part was cool and it was important. I think that there's not a whole lot else good that can be said. It had some good cards in it, but I don't know that that's not something I'm going to give them a ton of credit for. You had a couple good cards in your deck. Great.
So I'll do a little bit better for them. So this is actually the first set that significantly used creature tokens and creature counters. In fact, if you remember back in the day, Magic actually had a companion magazine that was released every month called The Duelist, and one of the issues of The Duelist came with a big punch out counter pack, and it actually had all the Fallen Empires tokens and counters. So you had the +2/+2 counters and the +1/+0 ones, and then the Saprolings and etc. Anyway, I mean, obviously these aren't the best examples of that, but sets up to that actually hadn't explored that space at all. And I think it actually kind of like broke a little bit of the dams when it came to counters and tokens. And obviously now they're just like such a foundational piece of what Magic is. I mean, you get a token every pack in modern Magic sets. And I think that's kind of like you should give a nod to Fallen Empires for actually introducing those.
Yeah, no, actually, that's a really good point. I do think the Saprolings in particular, were a pretty solid win.
All right. So there were some good takeaways from Fallen Empires, but overall ranked very low as far as, if you were going to sort of stack rank every set ever printed, this would probably be pretty low on the list. Homelands. What is the relation of Homelands to Fallen Empires? Were these related sets in any way, or?
I mean, temporally in that Homelands came out the year after Fallen Empires, but no, past that, not really.
But otherwise they weren't.
Yeah, it's important to note just before we get to Homeland that Ice Age is a set that actually got released in between. We're not going to talk about Ice Age in this podcast just because it's its own block and it kind of like doesn't get tied into these sets very well. So like just for the audience out there, note that we know that Ice Age actually temporally got released between Fallen Empires and Homelands, but we're skipping all the way to Homelands because they're kind of connected in some ways.
Yeah, it's interesting because Ice Age was a proper set release, right? Kind of the way that we think about it now, it was a massive set, right? It had 380 something cards in it or whatever. Homelands is much closer to what we just saw from Fallen Empires. It's only got 140 cards in it. It was a much smaller thing.
Yeah.
So give us some context, TBS, for what the world looked like when this came out. This was a year after.
So released in October 95, so almost a year after Fallen Empires. This is actually a pretty light year for Magic. I mean, when you think about it, like there was like almost 10 sets if you include all the base sets, kind of like up in 93 to 94, and then there was like just 2 sets in 95, Ice Age and Homelands. Homelands is like basically done by a kind of splinter design group of R&D. Like they had some people who just wanted to make a set, and they basically gave them the ability to make Homelands.
I was actually going to ask you about this. This part of what I heard, the genesis of this was customer service saying, like, I bet we could make a good set.
Right.
It's actually customer service making the set, not only them, but well, they did a good job. I think proving the need for good designers.
Definitely. Because we were talking about, contextually speaking, some of the worst sets ever printed. This is one that gets a lot of votes for the worst set, right?
Oh, yeah. And that's part of why I think this episode was sweet, is we get to tackle head on the 2 of Magic's worst sets ever. Like, I don't know if they're literally 1 and 2 or the bottom 1 and 2, but if you made a list of the worst 5 Magic sets, you would definitely include both of these. I don't know at exactly which points though.
Okay, so where should we you go ahead, TBS.
No. It's Homelands is just one of those sets that like had the potential of being actually quite interesting. That like you have a look at some of the themes it's going for, and we'll kind of get to what I mean specifically, but. Like on power level, just like Fallen Empires, like just misses on every level. There's so few good cards in this set when it comes to power level, and it's just essentially just so many unplayable cards.
I mean, Homelands and Fallen Empires lack the charm of the early sets, but also don't have good cards, and even their oddballs aren't sweet. It's really just the worst of all worlds. There's like. Even if you took power level aside, how many cards in Homelands do you think are really cool? And the answer is just not very many.
Right. There's very few. Going over this when we were getting ready for the show, I bring up the set in images because I played during this time. So there's a lot of them that stand out to me as like, oh, I remember that card. Right. And there's a few that do here that I remember, but my goodness sakes, there are very few and they are not good. Really bad. Where should we start with diving into these? Should we go by color or what do you guys want to do? Because this is just a total mess when you look at it.
I guess color, but it's not even clear that that's actually the best way to look at it because there's not a lot of thematic continuity between the colors.
There's even less than Fallen Empires by a lot, yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot of mechanical tie-ins. One thing to note: Homelands actually brings back something that was great in a previous set, which is Legends. Legends were kind of like, a really cool thing in the set. Legends themselves were like pretty exciting. So they said, okay, let's bring back Legends, and I think that's a good idea. I think that's actually was a fairly good basis, and they even had some names of characters connected to like the base set. Like we'll get to it, but we have Baron Sengir, and that refers to the Sengir vampire that was in the original Alpha set. But none of these legends are good, and none of them are particularly interesting. And I think that's a huge miss when you say, okay, we're doing legends again, and it's just like falls flat.
Right.
Also, weirdly enough, there's multiple arts again, but only on very few cards, and only 2 arts this time. So
yeah,
I don't really know what that's going on. But like, if you look at all the white cards, there are some individually cool cards. Abbey Gargoyles, for example, is 2 white for a 3/4 flying pro red. Like, I think that's a pretty solid design. Like, protection was a thing back then. I don't think protection is the greatest mechanic. In fact, I don't think it's particularly good, like in terms of a good design. But it is a mechanic people liked, and it had some degree of fun to it. And this was at least a card you could put in your deck and think you had a good reason to do so. But there's nothing connecting these cards. There's a Soraya the Falconer. Another one of the cooler cards is 1 white for a 2/2 legend. All Falcons get +1/+1. Target Falcon gains banding, and then there's one Falcon in the set. There's Mesa Falcon, which is 1 white for 1/1 flying, and then you can pay 2 to give it +1/+1. So,
yeah, go on. Sorry.
Like, I guess the idea is you combine her with other Falcons. There's Zephyr Falcon and Legends. There may be one other Falcon at the time. Like, what are we trying to accomplish with this?
Yeah, this is a real mess. This one, when you go through and look at these cards, there's just nothing bringing them together. It's really rough, and the power level is extremely low.
I mean, look at Sarah Paladin. Sounds like a cool card, right? 2 white for a 2/2 Paladin. You can tap to avert 1 damage to any creature or player. Okay, that's reasonable. It also has 1 white tap. Attacking does not cause target creature to tap this turn. So for 3 mana and tapping this, you can give a creature vigilance. And that is a case study in how adding a bad ability makes a card worse. Yes, it is technically a stronger card because it has the second ability. It would be a much stronger design if you just left that off. Because you put that ability on, it's insulting how bad that ability is. Right. And at that point, you look at that card and you're like, what is this card? This is garbage. Whereas if it was a 4 mana 2/2 that tapped for prevent 1, that's not actually that bad considering cards at the time.
Yeah, it does become apparent that they were just kind of throwing stuff at the wall, right? Just like, we'll see what we do here, and see what happens. And I'm sure that they were thinking in the bigger context of Magic and hoping that these cards would slot into people's decks or that people would like them. But boy, it does show that, like, if you don't have a well thought out plan, sometimes these things can fall very flat on their faces. All the stuff you guys said about Fallen Empires just seems multiplied here, where this is just really unexciting stuff. The only cards that stood out to me just scrolling through that I remember liking or being at least excited about were Baron Sengir. I thought that card was sweet. For whatever reason, I like Ison's Shade. Maybe it's just the artwork.
For whatever reason, Marshall names maybe the 3rd best card in Homelands or something.
Yeah, well,
like this card was actually good.
Was it good? I don't even remember what it did. But
it's 3 black for a 5/5 pro white legend. This led to one of the most iconic sequences in Magic history where I don't remember who it was. I want to say Mark Justice, but I really can't remember. Someone cast Demonic Consultation for Dark Ritual to try to cast Ethan's Shade. They consulted for 2 Dark Rituals and then decked themselves, but their plan was to double ritual out of Ethan's Shade.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
The important thing about Ishan's Shade at the time was that so many decks used Swords to Plowshares as their creature removal. And so Ishan's Shade was basically like untargetable by many, many decks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Lightning Bolt doesn't kill it. Swords can't kill it. And then that was the majority of removal that was in a lot of the early Type 2 standard formats.
there are some cards that are cool. I mean, starting at white was rough because I don't even know if there's like a single cool white card. Like here's another card that kind of annoys me is Beastwalkers is 1 white for a 2/2, and you can pay a green to give it banding. So the card itself is fine. Banding is not the best mechanic. In fact, banding is one of the worst of all time. So maybe you shouldn't do more of it. But Beastwalkers, when you see that, it implies, that maybe there's a cycle of creatures with off-color activateds. Nope, it's just the only one in the set.
That's weird.
Like, and they were so close to doing something good there. Like, imagine if every color had a creature that had an off-color activated ability. Like, that's a cool way to suggest something about creature pairs. I guess Daughter of Autumn in green has a white activated ability. So the joke is that white and green both kind of look at each other and activate abilities. But like,
they traded a card or something. And by the way, when you said banding is one of the worst, you meant worst design mechanics, right? Like, it's a good mechanic. Yes. Like,
it's a strong mechanic.
Yeah,
it's a very poorly designed one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a bunch of little stuff, but white really has basically nothing going for it. What about blue? Is there anything that ever you guys remembered about blue being good?
So one of the cool things about blue, and this is actually just one card, is a Labyrinth Minotaur. Is 3 and a blue for a 1/4. It's a Minotaur, and it says creatures Labyrinth Minotaur blocks don't untap during their next untap. The reason I think it's cool is that red has a little Minotaur theme, and in fact, there's didgeridoo. As an artifact, this is an artifact. It's 1 mana. It's an artifact. You can pay 3 to put a Minotaur from your hand into play. There's like a little bit of Minotaur tribal, and red has, an Abba Spirit Crafter. It gives all Minotaurs +1/+0, and an Abba Ancestor. It can tap to give a Minotaur +1/+1. So blue having a Minotaur, I think, is actually one of the cooler things you can say about blue, despite the card not being that interesting. And that's rough, right?
Yeah.
Like, blue has. Go ahead.
No. So you finish off, Louis.
Yeah, but blue has two pretty good cards. Like, these are maybe the 2 of the best cards in Homelands overall. Merchant Scroll, which you probably have heard of because you can see a lot of play in older formats of 1 and a blue sorcery. Go look for a blue instant and put in your hand. And then Memory Lapse, 1 and a blue counter target spell. Put that spell on top of its owner's library.
So actually, one thing that's interesting about Memory Lapse at the time when this set was released, people thought it was so bad, right? People were just like, oh, hold on, I can play Counterspell right now. Like, why do I want to have this particular ability? And actually, I mean, Memory Lapse has a lot of advantages over like Counterspell in some ways. Like, if it's a spell that is like time sensitive, then Memory Lapse is as good as a counter and it's easy to cast. And sometimes you just don't want to draw that card again. So it actually taught people some kind of like very subtle things. And it actually was the backbone of some of the first tempo decks. There was a deck called Forgotten Orb. So basically someone would cast a spell, you would Memory Lapse it, put it on top of the deck, and they would tap themselves out. And then you play Winter Orb, which is basically a 2-mana artifact that you only were allowed to untap one land a turn. And so you kind of lock them underneath the spell they just cast. And that was actually a really, really cool like evolution in deck design at the time, because tempo was a pretty like late coming concept in Magic. I mean, people knew about card advantage pretty early, but tempo probably didn't come until like almost 2 to 3 years after Magic started. And so, we all know tempo now. I mean, maybe too much, and some people call things tempo that aren't tempo, but but tempo was actually a pretty new idea, and this is even prior to Mana War and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, before those type of cards came out.
Well, part of it too is older cards didn't lend themselves to tempo. Like, the games just weren't like that as much. But I agree that I remember the Winter Orb Memory Lapse combo and people saying like, oh yeah, like Memory Lapse Winter Orb, like that's how it's better than Counterspell, because you lock them out of, their next draw step is going to be something expensive and bad. So it's actually even a little bit better. Sea Sprite's another standout. 1 and a blue, 1/1 flying pro red. This card did some good things for Constructed. You got to play your 1/1 flying pro red against the mono red burn decks, and it gave blue a fighting chance against those aggressive red decks. And then other than that, it's again not particularly themed or resonant. And they did have over the course of this set a bunch of these like weird enchantments. Like Ether Storm is 3 and a blue for an enchantment that nobody can play creatures. but anyone can pay 4 life to kill Aetherstorm. It's just like a weirdo. And like Mystic Decree is an enchant world, so they had. And how is Aetherstorm not an enchant world and Mystic Decree is? Who knows? It's 2 blue. All creatures lose flying, island walk. The combo with there was Island Sanctuary, where you got to make it so only creatures with flying island walk could attack you. But bam, Mystic Decree. No creatures could have flying or island walk.
Boom. Yeah. You also see a lot of, speaking of what you just mentioned, the color pie just not being sorted out yet. Right. I don't know when that concept came into being. I don't actually have any idea for when, I don't know if Richard Garfield had that in his head, but they just hadn't sorted out how things would actually go. But you see a lot of things that you would never see now. Where other colors are picking up random prevention abilities or first strike on random stuff that just don't really slot into how we view the color pie now. And it's apparent that they were still sorting that out.
Yeah, it's like, I think Richard Garfield actually had a pretty good idea about the color pie. Like he had a looser concept of like how bleed worked. Like he actually was more prepared to like let abilities go to other colors that don't normally have it, but like as long as there was some sort of like negative effect, if you think of it like Psionic Blast or something else like that, he was like, okay, you can do that. I actually think a lot of the designers of, let's say, Fallen Empires and Homelands actually didn't have anywhere near a grasp of that. They just did things fairly top down and fairly like randomly. Now they looked at old cards to kind of get some guidance about like what cards could be made, but I actually don't think they had a good grasp on a color pie and any sort of consistency. Everything felt like it was just like fairly arbitrary and very, very top down.
Yeah, a card I see here is Revoca Wizard Savant 2 blue. For a legend, it taps to do 2 damage to a creature or player, and it doesn't untap during next untap step. Right? Like we had this sort of with Tim, right, the Prodigal Sorcerer. But this is like a double Prodigal Sorcerer. And, these things just, you don't see them now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Revoca was actually within the defined color pie for the time. It is. I agree with you. It's not now.
Well, that's kind of what I'm saying is that whatever they had back then doesn't match what we have now.
No, but I think in addition, TBS is right in that the designers of Homelands and Fallen Empires clearly didn't understand the color pie then or now. Right. They just made cards at random.
Feast of the Unicorn, 3 and a black, enchant creature, target creature gets +4/+0. Okay.
Like, I think Rebecca or Revica or whatever is actually one of the coolest cards, because that's a card. And Homelands offers so few of these cards. That's a card where you look at it and you're like, ooh, how could I untap this to get extra shots in? Because it's powerful. And Instill Energy or something like that was one of like a cool way to do that. But yeah, overall, again, blue not very thematically tight. And then black had some cool stuff. It had Baron Sengir. It had the whole Sengir family, actually. So Baron Sengir is 5 black for a 5/5 flying. It's a legend, though. I have to assume it's Oracle to be a vampire at this point. Whenever a creature is put into the graveyard the same turn Baron damaged it, put a +2/+2 counter on Baron Sengir. See, Sengir Vampire, that just gets you a +1/+1 counter.
Times 2.
The Baron gets a 2/2. And you can tap it to regenerate a vampire. So power level wise, yeah, Baron Sengir is not actually good. Again, he's cool enough that didn't matter. I remember putting Baron Sengir in my deck.
I think this is the headliner from the set, right?
Oh, yeah.
This is the Shivan Dragon of this set, if you will.
Most certainly.
Yeah, at least it's cool. I actually think it's a cool looking card. It's like nostalgic. I mean, even back then it was like, oh, cool. This is the king of vampires. It all made sense. I actually think it's probably one of the better design cards, even though it's not that complex how it's designed.
Good designs don't have to be complex. I mean, we all know that. I mean, I know you know that, but it's resonant. It's cool. It does what you think that Dracula would do, right? This is the Dracula equivalent. And it has callbacks to one of the most beloved alpha cards, Sengir Vampire. That was a card that also, was something that people really liked. And it's funny because there's also a Grandmother Sengir. This is a 4 and a black for a 3/3. and she can pay 1 and a black and tap to give a creature -1/-1 till end turn. And then Irini Sengir. This is 2 black for a 2/2 legend. White enchantments and green enchantments cost an additional 2 to cast. So the other cards maybe not so cool, but the fact that there's even the black carriage. It's 3 black for a 4/4 carriage with trample, and it doesn't untap, but you have to sack a creature to untap it. How cool is that?
It's literally called black carriage, by the way.
Yes, it's the Baron's evil black carriage, and you have to feed the horse's creatures to make it untap.
That's right. There's Sengir Autocrat and Sengir Bats as well. They really did try to delve deep into the castle of Sengir here, it looks like.
Well, Sengir Autocrat, I think, is actually one of the coolest cards in the set. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's 3 and a black for a 2/2. And when it comes into play, you put 3/0/1 surf creatures into play as an SERF. And if it dies, you bury all the surfs. But it's actually a pretty good way to put tokens into play. It's 4 mana for 4 creatures. Mm-hmm. So there's some cool stuff you can do with that.
Yeah, for the truly ambitious among us, Sengir Bats is 1 black for a 1/2 flyer. But it has the Sengir ability that if it damages a creature and the creature dies, it gets a +1/+1 counter. But it's also a 1/2, so it can literally only eat 1/1s and 0/1s.
It's getting to eat some flying men. It's like, okay.
The insects, yeah.
Oh, look, here's another enchant world, Koskun Falls. It's 2 black for an enchant world. During your upkeep, tap target untapped creature you control or bury Koskun Falls. No creatures can attack you unless its controller pays additional 2 to attack. So I guess this came before propaganda and well before Ghostly Prison, but black taxing attackers, again, purely random. It just
purely random.
And what does that have to do with Koskun Falls? Does it have to do with tapping a creature? Also, how is this an enchant world? It only affects your opponent. That's just not even what enchant worlds are supposed to do.
This is a total mess. Seriously.
So in my mind, Fallen Empires and Homelands were relatively close. Now that we're really diving into both sets, Homelands is so much worse than Fallen Empires.
This is really terrible.
You were right, TBS. It's not close. Yeah. Homelands is just complete garbage.
It's funny, the red, you mentioned the Minotaurs, but then there's also these random legends that kind of I remember. There's Aaron the Relentless, Joven, just one word name, Joven, and Chandler. Right? These are all I remember these random legends that, I don't know, maybe people played more than they should have because they overvalued things being legendary or whatever.
Well, Aaron the Relentless is legitimately cool and good card, I think. So it's 2 red and 3. He basically has haste, and it's a 5/3, and you can regenerate for 3 red. This is not the most powerful. Right, sorry, 5/2. Sorry. Yeah. It's not the most powerful card, but you can actually see a deck that actually wants this card. It's kind of like a ball lightning. There is some upside. But yeah, you're right. I mean, these cards just have no place. They're just kind of cards to be cards, which is kind of the biggest sin of game design. If you just do something just to put something onto cards, cards are a precious resource and should really have a purpose to making some of these cards.
Also, once again, triple red to regenerate, Color Pie, anybody? One of the cards that stood out to me from green was Autumn Willow. It had Shroud, and I mean, this is one of the earlier cards with Shroud, right? And you could unshroud it yourself.
Deadly Insect and Autumn Willow, I think, are the first 2 cards that were untargetable. I think Deadly Insect's Alliances, I guess, and Autumn Willow here in Homelands. 4 green, 4/4 can't be targeted by spells or abilities, but you can pay a green. Target player may target Autumn Willow until end of turn, and she saw some play. Autumn Willow was a good card.
Super boggle.
But taking a look at red, it has that Minotaur theme, which uses up a bunch of cards, and I think with good use. Adding a new tribe, again, why does red always get all these random, not fully supported tribes? Who knows? But adding a Minotaur tribe that seems like it plays fairly well with each other is pretty cool. It's got a bunch of random dwarves because no one can stop themselves. And one of the most prevalent themes with old cards, we're talking alpha through somewhere in the later 90s, it involves what the theme is of your opponent having islands. And because you look at Sea Serpent from alpha, it's buried if you don't have an island, can only attack if they have an island. There is this big thing that things that travel in the water need water to travel. So there's like Dwarven Sea Clan is 2 and a red for a 1/1. It's a picture of a boat, and it says summon dwarves. Tap at end of combat. Dwarven Sea Clan deals 2 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Use this ability only if this creature's controller controls any islands. And so it's like, oh, clearly you can't use the dwarves on the boat unless they have the islands. And there's a bunch of cards that involve islands, and almost every boat has some callback to it, whether it's pirate ship in Alpha or various things in other sets that require islands to attack. Or it's just funny how consistent it is. Where yes, boats and serpents need islands to operate, which I think the reason we're not seeing that anymore is it's just not a very fun concept. Like it's an intuitive concept, but it's not good gameplay.
Yeah, I think they've kind of moved away from these things that are so situational or like negative. Like there's not as many cards with drawbacks. If you have a look at like early Magic, there's actually quite a lot of cards with drawbacks because I think the designers thought that like it's interesting to try and like find how you can kind of avoid the drawback. And I think as modern card design is like, okay, people just aren't that interested in like trying to like nullify these drawbacks. They'd like cards that are like independently powerful or interesting. And I mean, maybe there could probably be a few more cards with drawbacks than there are. But I think overall, this is a good direction. Let's not have so many cards that like I have to work so hard just to avoid the bad things.
I want to call attention to Dwarven Pony as well. This is red for a 1/1. Summon Pony. 1 red, tap, target dwarf gains Mountain Walk until end of turn. So it's a tiny little dwarf call out, even though dwarves aren't really super supported in the set. Like I think that's the only card that really cares about dwarves specifically. And the flavor text is, I hear Helena's got a pony that can count to 6 and likes to eat meat. Like, what?
And that was from Chandler, by the way.
Yes, our boy Chandler. Chandler, by the way, is 4 and a red. It's a 3/3 legend. You can pay red to destroy target artifact creature. And you see Chandler and Joven are buddies. Joven's 3 red for a 3/3, and you can pay red, tap it to destroy target non-creature artifact.
Right. And they're all quoting each other on all of their flavor texts and stuff. It's just this kind of mess of. It really does feel like a juvenile attempt at making a Magic set. Like this would be cool if
really
and then they just went with it.
Got a bunch of people from customer service to make a Magic set.
It's bad.
And then green has, like you mentioned, Autumn Willow is pretty nice. It has a tiny, thematically tiny because they're fairies, little fairy sub theme with fairy nobles, 2 and a green for a 1/2. And it says flying, all fairies you control get +0/+1 and tap it. All fairies you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Ooh. Alongside Willow Fairy and Willow Priestess as I believe the only 2 fairies in the set. Yep, that's what it looks like. So it's got it can bolster your 2 mana 1/2 flyer and your 4 mana 2/2 that lets you tap and put a fairy from your hand into play, which it's all the fairies in the set cost 2 mana, so not the most exciting there.
Right.
Yeah, like there is not a huge theme here. There's Primal Order was actually one of the stronger cards. Yeah. Again, they must have flipped a coin deciding whether these were enchant worlds or not. This clearly should be. It's 2 green enchantment. During each player's upkeep, Primal Order deals 1 damage to that player for each non-basic land he or she controls. So Primal Order, I mean, that was a banger. Like you play that when they have 2 or 3 non-basics in play, like that's going to get them pretty fast.
Yeah.
And non-basic hate punishes all the rich people with dual lands while you're out there grinding it out with all your basics.
Yeah. I mean, you bought Homelands, so you probably didn't have that much money.
One of the best green cards, it might be the best green card after Autumn Willow. Autumn Willow is the best green card, is Spectral Bears. 1 and a green for a 3/3. And if it attacks and they don't have any black permanents, it doesn't untap during your next untap step. But a 2 mana 3/3, I mean, that was a pretty big game.
Yeah, that's a good game.
And it was actually good at the time of Necropotence decks. And we won't go into those decks specifically, but like they were really, really one of the most powerful like standard decks of any era, and they were mono black, and so Spectral Bears were actually a good foil at the time for those decks.
So
there's some weird cards. Clockwork Swarm. I'm getting a little ahead of green, but like.
Well, I mean, if you want to move on to artifacts, the best card in Homelands, I think overall, is probably Serrated Arrows.
Yeah, that card.
It's a four mana artifact. It comes into play with 3 counters on it, and you can tap it and remove a counter to give a creature a -1/-1 counter. So, first of all, this killed those Pump Knights we just talked about from Fallen Empires, the Order of Liber, Order of the Ebon Hand. And it's 4 mana for 3 -1/-1 counters distributed kind of as you please, even though it takes you a few turns to use it. I mean, that's pretty good stuff. Serrated Arrows, well, here's how bad Homelands was. At one of the first Pro Tours, they had, I think it was actually literally the first Pro Tour, TBS, you might know better than me. They had the rule where you had to play 5 cards from every set. The Homelands was so bad, they had to enforce a rule that forced you to play 5 cards from Homelands, 5 cards from Fallen Empires. And Serrated Arrows, that was one of the cards.
Some people actually played cards in their sideboard that they never played to just to account for the 5 cards from Homelands. It's like, okay, we don't want to put a card in our deck. I mean, and like we've already talked about Homelands being the worst set of all time. Well, just in case it might have got too powerful, they actually have Apocalypse Time, which is a 2 mana artifact, and 2 tap, sacrifice a chime, and bury all cards from Homelands. So,
and the thing is, first of all, this card's obviously really funny because Homelands is so bad. Second, like this is just a retread of the like Golgothian Silex or whatever, or City of Brass, like the ones from Antiquities and Arabian. So
City in a
it's
Bottle,
not,
yeah.
City in a Bottle, of course. So it's not even treading new ground.
Yeah. Oh, God. And these were so bad, right? I mean, these took you right out of any imaginative universe that you had created, and they're literally referencing things that you can buy here on Earth in the real world. It's so terrible. One other thing I wanted to mention before we recap Homelands here was, boy, as a modern day game designer in Magic, it must be really tough to look through this, not only because of the horrendous card designs and lack of coherency that we've already talked about. But here's a few of the one-word card names that they burned on Homelands. And I bet you if you're listening right now, you don't know what any of these do. Truce, Forget, like a Magic card called Forget, and we don't even know what it does. Jinx, Prophecy, Torture, Ambush, Renewal, Shrink. There's a card called Retribution in this set, which could be really cool. And there's also one called Roots, which is kind of funny. But I mean, oh man, if we could just erase this set and make a card now called Forget, like it would be this sweet variant on a counterspell or whatever. What could you do with the card Jinx? Something really cool. And unfortunately, I'll tell you, here's a good example. This is what Jinx actually does. It's 1 and a blue for an instant. Target land becomes the basic land type of your choice until end of turn. Draw a card in the beginning of next turn's upkeep. That's what they did for Jinx. That was how they chose to burn these cards. And there's just so few cards, so few one-word names that would be on a card now that are even available. And these ones are just, tossed to the Homelands burn pile for history.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about that, and yeah, that is definitely true. It is pretty rough not being able to use Retribution or Jinx or any of these cool names.
Here's another one, Evaporate. Yeah, just some cool words, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like Didgeridoo, like without Didgeridoo, like I don't really know where you can go from there.
I feel like they landed in a pretty good place.
That card is perfect.
It's perfect.
I love Didgeridoo actually.
Yeah, they nailed it.
I mean, at the end of the day, you want cards and sets that capture your imagination. And it's not just power level, and it's not just coolness, and it's not just any one thing. It's just different. You want a variety of them, right? Because different people are attracted to different things. But you want to make sure you're hitting some of those notes. And cards that are just randomly complicated aren't very fun. Cards that are just so clearly bad are a little harder to get into. And look, like Didgeridoo is a great example. I saw Didgeridoo, and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I want to make a Minotaur deck. It turned out the Minotaur deck sucked. The Minotaurs just aren't good, and they're all pretty cheap, so it's not like you're even really getting too good a value off the old Didgeridoo. But it kind of didn't matter because at that point, Homelands already kind of got me with Didgeridoo in that I thought it was really cool. And so many of these cards are just rough, where it's just they're not cool, and they're not good, and they're not fun.
So big picture speaking here, is this the worst set ever? And what were any of the positives that may have come away from it?
I think it's the worst set ever. I mean, of like just expansions, I think it just committed so many sins and added nothing. So when you really think of it that way,
it's pretty bad.
Yeah, look, I understand back then they didn't know really as much like about the game and the game design of it, but like they had the template of some very good sets prior to that, right? So just some, just looking at like Legends or Arabians or even Antiquities to some extent, there's a kind of good template to follow, and then to have these two sets, but especially Homelands. I just think, I would have been so sad if Magic ended because of these sets. Mm-hmm. Like it would have been, I loved Magic at this time. I actually started playing a lot at this time, and it was a real dry spell.
Huh, that's a card in the set, by the way.
Very nice.
I think Homelands had some individually cool cards. It wasn't all misses. Baron Sengir is probably the standout. And I mean, look, I was playing at this time, and I remember putting a number of these cards in decks and being happy about it. Homelands was really bad. And looking at this set, yes, I believe it is the worst set of all time. It probably wasn't as dangerous as Fallen Empires to the health of Magic because of the overprinting issue and because the first bad set's, I think, a lot more damaging than the second one. But still, design-wise, yeah, this was the worst. There's a couple gems in here, but not many. And yeah, I mean, the best thing Homelands and Fallen Empires probably did is taught designers some lessons of what not to do. So gave them a incentive and some data of, yeah, maybe we shouldn't just make all cards that suck. Like power level does matter, and also giving people more experience and giving people more cards to look at and more sets to get reactions from. Like people learn more over time. I've used this analogy before, but the average NBA player is so much better than the average NBA player 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever. Every single successive leap, right, is a huge leap forward for the current players. Magic sets aren't that different. And this is part of why me and TPS lose our minds about Alpha. Alpha somehow stands the test of time. It's actually absurd. Like it's incredible. It's the best Magic set of all time. And it's so awesome when you compare Alpha to all these other sets here. It should, I hope, give you even more respect for the design of Alpha, because good Lord.
For sure.
It's the Wilt Chamberlain of sets.
Like it would stand up to modern players. It would dunk on modern players.
Yes. Now, we have one more set to talk about before we take off, but we're not going to go in depth on it. It's just one that we wanted to touch on that came out around this era. And speaking of big mistakes, we're talking about Chronicles. TVS, what was Chronicles?
Okay, so Chronicles was a reprint set that was released in July 1995. So what I mean by reprint set, so we obviously had, like these core sets like Revised, Alpha, and Fourth Ed actually was, I think at this time, I'll have to double check that. And Chronicles was basically their opportunity to reprint some of the cards from the original, I think, first sets up to Dark, so they could get them back into circulation, because all the black-bordered sets, they had limited print runs, and they enforced them really harshly, as in, like, once that print run was over, they didn't actually print them again, and that was actually quite unusual for card sets back then. But the whiteboarded sets, like 4th edition and beyond, were allowed to be printed as many times as possible. And Chronicles was an ability to basically add some cards to that card pool so they could reprint them on and on. So there's actually a lot of cool cards in Chronicles. And actually, it introduced me to a lot of cards from Legends, Arabians, and Antiquities that I actually hadn't played with. And at the time, these cards were actually added to the standard format. It was called Type 2 at the time, but you could actually play these cards, and they actually made a really, really big impact in that format.
Right. So they went through and selected certain cards from Arabian Nights, Antiquities, Legends, and the Dark, and reprinted them white border but with their original set symbols on them as well. And this actually sent shockwaves through the Magic scene at the time, not because of the reprints themselves from tournament perspective, but from the collector perspective.
Yeah, Chronicles. I mean, if we're talking about things that have negatively impacted Magic, without Chronicles, there'd be no reserve list. Chronicles is what created the reserve list, and so the reserve list is a list. I don't know the exact date that it was published. This was like 1998 or something like that. Because it was published like around when Mirage was out, I think. But Chronicles is kind of what started it. And this is a list of Magic cards that WotC has said they will never reprint. And the reason was in order to keep collector confidence that their expensive Moxes weren't going to get reprinted. And because what Chronicles did, I remember this pretty clearly. Ice Age actually had a little bit of this too, because they reprinted Icy Manipulator specifically in Ice Age. But Chronicles made it so a lot of the cards in Chronicles dropped precipitously in value. Because at that point, Horn of Deafening or Zira Arian or City of Brass, like there were just so many more than there were before, because the print run of Chronicles was just much larger. You could get a hold of it. You could go buy packs of Chronicles. Whereas with Arabian Nights and all these other sets, it was too late. So the player that was me back then liked Chronicles because I got to, like TBS said, not only did I get to see and interact with cards that I wouldn't have because there's just so few of the original cards, I also got to get a hold of cards I wanted to get a hold of and weren't able to, like Urnham Djinn. It's 3 and a green for a 4/5. During your upkeep, target non-wall creature an opponent controls gains Forest Walk until end of turn. Like, Urnham Djinn was like one of the best creatures for a long time, especially for green. And, it was in Arabian, it was hard to get, and getting Urnham Djinn in Chronicles was really cool. I got to play with the card that the good players had. Like, I enjoyed that. That was, that was fun. And I didn't have much of a collection, so, that part was cool too. But Chronicles did lead to kind of a panic. And a lot of people were unhappy that their old expensive cards, or not even that old at this point, but their cards, that their rare expensive cards were worth less. And the commotion was enough, and I guess it built up over a couple of years, that the reserve list came out, and I think the reserve list is an abomination.
Yeah, it was an overreaction for sure, but also it was an important step for the community to say, hey, if you're going to pillage your own product in this way, we're not going to partake, right? Because Chronicles was a bad idea from that perspective of, because look, you can see it from two sides, right? On one hand, you have young Luis who saved up his money to get a Legends pack and then never even had a chance to buy one after a certain point and couldn't get his hands on these cards because there were so few of them around that they were too expensive for him. Now he can go down to the store and get this white bordered version, which doesn't look as cool, isn't as sought after, but still he gets to play with, Nebuchadnezzar or whatever. And have access to these cards. It's better for the player pool to have access to the cards to play with them. But then from the other side, you do have to look at cards that actually have third party value and when they do, you don't want to feel like the company that prints them can just turn on the cash machine anytime they want and say, oh, that card's worth $100. Well, hell yeah, we'll reprint a bunch of those now, and people will come flocking to them because they can't buy them anywhere else because it's worth $100, and we're just going to control our cash flow that way. Then you feel like there's no stability, and the company that produces these cards is willing to undercut that at any time. That's not good either, right? You want to build up some good long-term fan base for your game, which Magic's done a better job than most games ever. But part of the reason is because they recognized, okay, we can't just reprint all the stuff that people want all the time. That isn't a good path either.
People really thought that Moxes and Lotus had a good chance of getting reprinted this time. I remember, like, the talk was, if they did this, like the 4th edition also had a lot of like reprints in as well, and so the combination of like Chronicles and 4th edition really shook collectors to their core. I mean, to try and like get the scope of like the concern, if you remember, like just very recently, with all the card bannings and things like that, people were really worried about the future of Magic. I think that people were even more scared about the future of Magic during this period of time where you had these reprints from 4th edition and Chronicles and these bad sets in the form of Fallen Empires and Homelands. This was a really precarious time in Magic's history and could have killed it essentially in the cradle.
Yeah, because it's to be fair to Wizards, when we talk about Magic now and things that can kill Magic, and of course Wizards isn't going to just go willy-nilly reprinting. People really had no reason to believe that back then. This game had been out for 2 years, this wasn't something that had this long, well-established history and this, huge apparatus built around it. Yeah. Why wouldn't they decide that they should just reprint Moxes, Lotuses, cash out, and then go retire? It didn't seem like there was anything stopping that. And to some degree there wasn't. They could have done that. Obviously it was much smarter of them not to, and to be visionaries and to make, $500 million a year for many years, not make $10 million in 1 year or whatever.
Right.
But I understand the desire for consumer confidence, especially after the overprinting of Fallen Empires, that you're seeing reverberations from that still, right? At this time where people were like, well, clearly they understand they can just turn the printing presses on and print as much as they want. And that was something people were very scared of.
Yeah. Let's do a quick crack pack of this Chronicles, because I just want to crack this thing open and see what these cards are like. If I remember, they're kind of hideous. Yeah, they're hideous. I mean, unless you love
they don't look good.
They're kind of washed out. These are really bad. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna cruise through these. I'm not gonna read every card just because we're kind of up against time here. But maybe if there's one that we recognize that we'd like to pick, here's Cat Warriors, Tormod's Crypt, Urza's Tower, Boomerang. I like that. Bog Rats can't be blocked by walls. Fountain of Youth. I don't want to tell you how many times I put Fountain of Youth in decks when I originally played Magic because it's free.
0 is a very powerful number.
It really is. 0, and then you pay 2, tap it, and gain 1 life. Gosbon Ogre, Mountain Yeti, some top-tier artwork from Dan Frazier there. Perhaps not his best work. Ashnod's Altar. All right. That's the card I built around most of my decks back in the day. You can sacrifice a creature to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool. Ivory Guardians. Okay, that's cool. Fire Drake, 1/2 flyer with thing. And then I'm assuming rare is Cocoon. I'll read this one because it's a whole book of text. It's green for an enchant creature. Tap target creature you control and put 3 change counters on Cocoon. If there are any change counters on Cocoon, that creature does not untap during its untap phase. During your upkeep, remove 1 change counter. During the upkeep after the one in which the last change counter was removed, put a +1/+1 counter on the creature. That creature gains flying and bury Cocoon. That's pretty cool. A little top-down action there. What would we take out of the pack? I don't know, maybe Fire Drake or something.
Mountain Yeti, pretty good. This is 2 red for a 3/3 Mountain Walk Pro White. It's burly. It's good against red decks or white decks. So
yeah, I might take Boomerang. We're turning.
I'm a Boomerang.
Yeah, bounce their land or whatever. Anyway, but Chronicles definitely one of the most impactful sets, but not from the good way. This was a thing that there needed to be lines drawn where we understood as consumers and as Magic players how things were going to be handled from Wizards of the Coast perspective. And it set into motion, again, I believe an overreaction from Wizards of the Coast, but still they really wanted to make it clear, no, okay, we're not doing it this way. This isn't how things are going to go, where we just farm the aftermarket for, things to reprint and then profit off of that at your expense. I mean, that's what that is, right? If they reprint cards that are worth, let's say they reprinted the cards that TBS said that the players are worried about at the time, the Lotuses and the Moxen and stuff like that, right? That is quite simply the price of your Mox that you have in your binder going down while the bank account from Wizards of the Coast goes up. And that is not a good feeling from a consumer perspective. And I really do want to reiterate what Luis said in that there was not that level of trust. Wizards of the Coast was a tiny company based in Renton, Washington. They weren't owned by Hasbro at this time. This was a startup, for lack of a better term. I mean, this was just they could have screwed this up any number of ways. And heck, look at what they did. I mean, they released Chronicles. That was a major misstep that they didn't see coming. They did these 2 sets that we covered, which were big misses, and really at a time when it would have served them well to capitalize on the incredible explosion of popularity that the game had in just a few short years of time. And they just misstepped really hard, at that time in multiple ways with multiple sets. So, this was a company that was still figuring out what it wanted to do and how it needed to approach this. And it's also worth noting that this was the first collectible card game. Like they were creating the model on the fly as they went. When they made the game, they did not know that it would be what it was going to be and that people would interact with it in the way that people interacted with it. Remember, all these Magic cards say Deckmaster on the back, but they were going to have different Magic backs for different expansion sets, and they thought that they would all be standalone. You played with these cards against other cards from its own set, and that they wouldn't mix together. And they very smartly realized that wasn't the case. But again, it shows that they didn't understand this product yet, which how could you? It didn't exist. And these were some of the big missteps early on that led them to kind of course correct and get eventually to the really quite formulaic version that we have these days. But it's a good formula, right? Like this is a spreadsheet or an algorithm or whatever it is that they do to make sets that works and that has been refined over years. And what we looked at today were the initial steps of that showed them what not to do, which is really interesting. Anything else, to put a cap on these last sets, TBS, that you wanted to make?
No, I mean, I kind of said most of what I feel about this time. Is like this was a kind of a dark time for Magic in many ways. I mean, it was a fun time because it's still the Wild West. When we start with the next show, we're going to be talking into kind of Magic, kind of moving into its kind of let's call it adolescence. It really started understanding itself, and a lot of the formula. Formulas that we are pretty familiar now, like you'll start seeing the form of that now. So I actually think it was like super fun to play during this time, but also, I mean, when I think about it, we knew so little.
Is it okay to like these sets even if they're so terrible?
Totally.
Okay. Yeah, because I kind of like these sets, but like, boy, they're bad. What about you, Luis? Any big picture stuff before we take off?
I think if Chronicles had a little bit more soul, I think it might not have been received so poorly. Mm-hmm. Like if instead of Chronicles, even for back then, it wasn't even attempting to make any sense. Like Antiquities had a theme, Arabian Nights had a theme, Fallen Empires had a theme. Like Homelands didn't have a theme, but again, that's because Homeland sucks. But having a resonant theme, whether you get there or not, is pretty cool. And if Chronicles was a set that was like some reprints, some new cards, and packaged in a way that made sense, it might not have felt like such a blatant just way to cash in on previous work. Mm-hmm. And if that was the case, I think Chronicles could have come across a lot better. Like, yeah, we would have run into some of the same complaints, I think. But look at core sets, even the core sets that are really high on reprints. I don't feel like people say like core sets are a scam because they have some reprints. Mm-hmm. Like core sets are there to accomplish a goal and get these cards out and do it in a way that makes sense. And Chronicles could have done that. Of course, I understand why they didn't know that. I'm not saying they should have known everything we know now, but I think there was a way for Chronicles to succeed, though I don't think it really did. Though, again, 13-year-old me or whatever did like the fact that I got to play with some of these cards that I wouldn't have gotten to play with otherwise.
I got to say, it's weird to hold Magic cards in my hand, by the way. I haven't done this in a while.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen a physical card of the last 3 or 4 sets or whatever.
Yeah, it's strange. Okay, well, let's call it a show there. Great stuff, guys. As always, super fun to take a look back in time and kind of examine these sets from both a historical perspective and also a modern design perspective with you two. It's always super fascinating. TBS, where can people find you, if they want to say hi or follow up with whatever you're up to?
Yeah, I think the easiest way just on Twitter. I'm at TBS- on Twitter, so just send me a DM or just and I'll try and get back to you.
TBS, thanks for coming on the show. As always, your insight is very much appreciated.
No, thank you. I really, really enjoy doing this.
Yeah, well, we'll look forward to the next one as well. If you want to find Luis on our social media, I'm Marshall_LR, and he is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast over at lrcast.com. If you want to support our sponsor, that's Channel Fireball. You can head over to channelfireball.com, where, once again, you can take a look for the Kaldheim crates. These are a great way to kind of get some of everything with some cool foils and bonuses to go along with your box of Kaldheim. You can pre-order those over at channelfireball.com right now. That's going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll see you next week.
Talking about all these decks has made me, or all these old sets has made me want to share with you guys the first real deck I had. And the funny part is, it actually involved the Channel Fireball combo.
No way.
No joke. So here's what happened is, back in the Stone Ages of Magic, I had a black-red deck. Okay. It didn't have a strong theme. It was basically good red and black cards I owned. It had. I mean, it was the point where I still had some understanding of what was actually good. So it had Lightning Bolt, it had Fireball, it had some Pump Knights. It was like somewhat aggressive. It had Hymn to Turok. It was kind of like a red-black removal discard deck. And I remember one of the guys at my shop. There's a tournament every Saturday, and the tournament cost $2 to play in. And it was tough though, because the shop also sold a combo for $2 where you could get a Hot Pocket and a can of soda. So when you roll up to the shop with $2, you really got to. Do I want to have a Hot Pocket and a soda and watch the tournament and play fun games, or do I want to compete in the tournament and try to win $5 of store credit?
Oh, that's amazing!
But if you win the store credit, you can buy the Hot Pocket. So
yeah.
So I remember one of the guys who played at the tournament, or every weekend, would frequently beat me with Ollie from Cairo plus Spectral Cloak. And so Ollie from Cairo is 2 red for a 0/1, and you can't take damage that would put you to less than 1 while it's in play. And Spectral Cloak is blue for an enchantment that makes the creature untargetable as long as it's untapped.
Mm-hmm.
And
it is a very difficult combo, yeah.
Yeah, the red-black deck, once he got those 2 cards down, what could I do? I wasn't able to really interact with it. I didn't have Earthquake. So what I decided was I would splash green for Tranquility. This is 2 and a green. It's a sorcery. It destroys all enchantments. And, because we did have sideboards. So I was like, okay, I can have Tranquilities in my sideboard. But then I thought, well, if the only green sources I play, because I wanted 4 green sources, are Havenwood Battlegrounds. This is a land that enters the battlefield taps for a green, or you can sack for green. I could also splash Channel in my deck. And it would effectively cost the same as 1 green, because all my sources provided double. And by playing Channel, I had Fireball, and I could Channel Fireball them. And
that is incredible.
I remember putting this deck together and playing it, and my friend had a black-white deck that had just good black and white cards, and we would all play against each other. And oh man, you can never go back to that time, but wow, Magic was a lot of fun then. It was just so much exploration. I don't know. I remember going to new card stores and seeing the decks people played and getting my mind blown, or seeing what cards the store had for sale. Because this is pre really good internet communities or anything. I wasn't really involved in that. And I just didn't even know what all the cards were. And I remember reading about them in Scry magazine and stuff. And yeah, there's this sense of exploration that I just don't get anymore. But obviously I'm pretty happy with Magic now too. It's just a different thing.